Chapter 29 of First Samuel is where we pick up tonight, and just a short little 11 verse chapter. Boy, so much has transpired in this book. This book was broken up into 3 sections. We saw the instigation of the kingdom, where everybody was hounding Samuel to give him a king, and then we saw Saul come in to be the king. And it didn't take long before that went downhill, right? And so then the whole second half of this book has been David being anointed to be king, but didn't take the throne. And there were so many lessons of character that God taught David in these 16 or so chapters. It's such a fascinating section that we're finishing tonight because, look, you'd think that the focus of this would be about the king. They have a king, King Saul. Let's talk about King Saul. But it was so miserable for Saul because of his disobedience that the focus was on David and his godliness. And he didn't ever always do everything right. We know that. He had moments where he would walk away or do things lacking in faith. We know that. But what's the difference between Samuel and Saul? What have we seen? Saul was always in it for himself, regardless of what the Lord wanted. Never came back to the Lord, even in moments of sorrow, even in moments of Saul being caught out. He would, I'm so sorry, for this. And then he would go right back to it because there was no genuine repentance. David, every time David had a shortcoming, we see him coming back to the Lord, coming back to the Lord. And don't forget that, because in so many ways, as we finish this book and then we go into 2 Samuel starting next week, in so many ways, David is a lot more of a scoundrel than Saul was. But David has a heart after God who always comes back to God. And that ultimately is what God is looking for. It has been some 15 years that Saul has been chasing David, envious, jealous of David, chasing him around. David has been on the run from Saul through the southern part of Israel, through the Judean wilderness. David's gone over and taken his parents over to Edom in the east. He's gone over to the Philistine territory along the Mediterranean coast himself. Recently, David is set up shop with them, the Philistines, over at the Mediterranean Sea. You might remember that. These are God's enemies. And here we find David at really a low point in his life. If you want to know, David had 2 specific low moments in his whole life. And I think the one most people think about is, when David gets involved with Bathsheba later, right? That whole moment of his life, the whole thing of sending Bathsheba's husband Uriah to fight and die so he could take Bathsheba after he committed adultery. And then the baby from that dies, and it's just a miserable low point for David. The other low point in David's life is right now. As we pick up here in chapter 29, David has been with the Philistines. He's been living in a Philistine city, Ziklag, for almost a year and a half. I mean, there's no better picture than being backslidden from where Christ wants you to be than that. He's literally living with the enemies. Okay? We talk about today about don't let the enemies live in your house, right? Crucify, whatever it is, whatever the addictions are, whatever the lusts are, crucify them, get them out of your house. David doesn't allow them into his house. David goes and lives with them. That's how bad this is for David. You can't serve the Lord when you're literally serving your enemies. So we find David here in chapter 29, as we pick it up, living with the Philistines. And sometimes that's the same thing for us. We find out that we're living a compromised life. And that's what David was up to at this point. He's living that compromised life with the Philistines. But in those times, God has made good promises to David, right? God promised David, you're going to be the king one day. And yet David's waited all of these years, 15 years. And you can start to wonder, is it really going to happen? Is everything God said really going to happen? And it can be the same for us, especially if you grow up in the church and your mom and dad were believers, and they've told you for the longest time, Jesus is coming again, Jesus is coming again. And after a while, you start to think is this real? Is it really going to happen? That's kind of the mindset of where David's at. He's just been living with the Philistines. Yeah, God promised me that, that king thing so long ago. I don't know. Not that he's ever expressed doubt, but you start to wonder, in your mind. And so as the book finishes up here, chapter 29, 30, 31, this is the culmination where God's timing is finally now to bring these things to pass. After 15 years, it's finally going to happen. God is going to start moving and making all kinds of things happen for his plan for David to take the throne to finally become reality. And so the title of the message tonight is Good Promises and God's Providence. See, to David and to us, God has made good promises, right? Of things to come, of life for now. And yet it's all in God's providence. It's all within God's providence of when he will do and what he will do to mold and change every situation, change others, change us. It's all in his domain on how and when these things are going to happen. And so we look at David and we're like, man, how could you go 15 years? Well, it's the same for us. There are times where we have to wait, or we have to be patient, or we have to let God do the changing to make something happen. And that's really the story of how this book finishes up right now. It's this, you're going to read these chapters of just boom, all of a sudden everything happens. Everything lines up for the promises of David taking the kingdom to happen. And you just think to yourself like, wow, this happened and this happened and this, and it just all fell into place. You ever thought that way before? Like it just all happened. That's God's providence to make it happen. That's God saying, okay, now it's time. I'm going to set things in motion. And until that happens, it's no good of us to try to force our way into things. And that's part of the lesson here tonight. So we're going to look at four aspects here of God's providence tonight in these final chapters as we conclude the book. So in chapter 29, again, David is living with the Philistines. You need to remember he's been there a while. When you're in an environment for about 6 months, you're there. It's regular to you after 6 months. He's been there almost a year and a half. So everything about his house he has now in the town of Ziklag, everything about the people he wakes up and sees every morning, he's accustomed to it. He's in this place of being backslidden from God. And so chapter 29 opens up with him there. And the first thing I want you to see about God's providence is that God knows how to move other people to fit his plan. Okay, we're going to look at the way God moves things around. The first one we see here in chapter 29, as short as it is that as God wants to fulfill his plan to David now, the first thing we see God doing is he moves other people. It's not even about David yet. God starts to move other things in the circumstance to get the ball rolling, to get the show on the road. So chapter 29, let's take a look at it. Verse 1 of chapter 29, it says, "Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel." Now this is interesting because this would have been very nostalgic to the Israelites of this time. Because if you don't remember, Aphek, that was the first battle back at the beginning of this book. Remember that? Way before Saul was king, Samuel was still a prophet, and Eli was the priest, and his sons were there, and Israel gathered together to fight against the Philistines who had gathered at Aphek. And that's the one where the Ark of the Covenant was taken, right? And Hophni and Phinehas, they died, and the whole thing, and then Eli heard about it, and he died because the Ark was taken. That was when a battle at this very same place happened. So as they're gathering here for this battle, and remember, Saul was just told by the witch of Endor that he's going to die. And so here they're gathering for this battle at this nostalgic place where every Jew would have grown up there in their whole life knowing what happened there. The ark was taken. Oh man, that was such a horrible defeat. And here they're gathering for this battle. The Philistines are going there to Aphek. And so just interesting. And so God is gathering them back together to this place. Saul's already been told by God through Samuel, the dead, that you're going to die today. And now here they see the Philistines gathering at Aphek. Wow. In verse 2, it says, "The lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed on in the rearward with Achish. Achish was the king of Gath, remember? And so David is really having an identity crisis. Here he is with Achish, the king of Gath, which is one of the Philistine cities. And these lords, these other princes in Philistia, of the other cities and things, they start putting pressure on King Achish, this other Philistine king, saying, wait a second, what's David doing with you? So David would have been in his little territory of the Philistines with Achish and his city of Ziklag, and these other princes wouldn't have had too much interaction with David. And all of a sudden, they're going to war against Israel, and these other princes are like, wait a second, don't bring him. That's going to be trouble. So verse 3, it says, then the princes of the Philistines said, what do these Hebrews here? Remember, that's another name for the Israelites, the Hebrews. What are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, is not David the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days or these years, and I have found no fault in him, since he fell to me upon this day. So Achish immediately defends David and David's men and says, well, I know they're Israelites, I know they're Hebrews, but he's been good to me. He's been loyal. This whole time he's been with us, there's been no trouble. He's clearly on our side. David has proven himself to me. Do you find something interesting about this? The Philistine king is saying to other Philistines, whoa, no, David's on our side. It's good. Look, when your friends are talking nice about you, that's good. When the friends of God are talking nice about you, that's good. But when the enemies of God are talking nice about you, that's not good. You don't want the enemies of God being like, oh, no, he's been great to us. He's treated us amazing. The enemies of God, what's the equivalent today? Lust, anger, envy, wrath, right? Don't treat them like friends. Don't let them treat you like friends. You don't want the enemies of God and you to be all buddied up. That's not a good, healthy thing. But here's Achish defending David to these other Philistines. And then in verse 4, the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. And the princes of the Philistines said to him, make this fellow to return, that he may go again to his place, which you have appointed him. They're talking about where David picked up a house in Ziklag. That's a Philistine city, Ziklag. Okay, so they're saying, make him go back to Ziklag, that he may go again to his place, which you have appointed to him, and let him go not down with us to the battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself to his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men? They're saying, look, David will take the opportunity of this battle with Israel to turn and side with Israel, and will die, is what they're saying. Verse 5, is not this David, of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands, and David has slew his 10,000s. And so they all know the song. This song has been going around for years, and they look at David and they're like, David, aren't you the one they were singing the song about? Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000. Yes, that song's about me, that kind of thing. And so they know of David's reputation. And so they want him to go back to his Philistine house in Ziklag. And see, the whole thing, guys, that don't miss, is this is God stirring up these lords, these princes of the Philistines, not just to accomplish their plan, but to accomplish God's plan. Do you see that? This is the beginning of what God's going to do. You don't see it yet, do you? Because maybe you don't remember the rest of the story that we're going to get to. But wait until you see what happens, especially as we open up chapter 30. All of a sudden, you're going to be like, I get it. God sent David away on purpose. So watch what happens here. God is moving in the heart of these Philistines to accomplish his will to get David on the throne of Israel. And he doesn't even know it yet. So this looks like they're asking David to do something he doesn't want to do. But it's all in God's plan to make this happen. Go to verse 6. In verse 6, then Achish called David and said unto him, surely as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your goings out and your comings in with me in the host is good in my sight. For I have not found evil in thee since the day of your coming to me unto this day. Nevertheless, the Lords do not favor you, David. So in verse 7, wherefore now return and go in peace, that you displease not the lords of the Philistines. So Achish clearly has an allegiance with the other Philistine leaders, and he's like, David, I can't, they don't want you here. I'm only one of the princes. We got to work this out, and I got to listen to them. So Achish tells David, you got to go back. You got to go back. So David was handed a way out right here. Okay? This is God trying to get David to not go to battle with Israel. And David, you're going to see in a second that David protests. And he tries to get to stay. And this is the Lord moving circumstances to get David to not go fight against Israel. And take a look at this in verse 8. David said unto Achish, but what have I done? And what have you found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go to fight against the enemies of my lord the king? David says, and Achish answered and said to David, I know that you are good in my sight as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the princes of the Philistines have said that he shall not go up with us to the battle. Wherefore now rise up early in the morning with your master's servants that are come with you, and as soon as you're up in the morning and there's light, you need to depart. So David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning to return into the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to the Jezreel Valley up in the north. So David even protests, no, I want to go with you. I want to go with you. This is my home now, right? And all the while, David's not getting it. He's not getting it. This is your time, David. This is your time. See, that same thing happens to us guys sometimes. We see a circumstance come into our life, or you see somebody that doesn't even know God, and they start to influence your life, and they start to make something happen to you that you didn't want to happen. And you're like, God, why are you allowing that to happen? It may very well look ugly, but it may very well be God's plan to move somebody to the place they need to be. Years later, there's going to be a descendant of this very King David who's going to be very, very pregnant. And there's going to be a real powerful king who took the title Caesar, that's going to make a decree that says everybody has to go back to their place of origin, their hometown, and Mary and Joseph are going to have to ride the whole way back down to Bethlehem as she's 9 months pregnant. And the whole time they could be thinking, oh, I can't believe Caesar's doing this to us. I can't believe Caesar's doing this to us. I can't believe. Wait a second. This is God doing this. That was God pulling the strings of the marionette Caesar to make him send them back to Bethlehem so that the Messiah could be born exactly where he was supposed to be born. So look, don't be surprised if even in our lives, people do things in our lives and we're like, I don't like that. Why do I have to go way down to Bethlehem? I don't like that. Why do I have to leave the war and just go home? I don't like that. And the whole time, maybe God's doing something. Maybe God's doing something. So be patient and let God's will work its way out. You could be Joseph saying, I don't want to be in prison. I don't like that. Joseph of Old Testament, right? 13 years I've been here, God. I don't like that. And the whole time God's saying, I'm sending you ahead. I've got a plan. In my province, I've got a plan here. And that's exactly what David's going to find. It's exactly what he's going to find. Now, look, go into a couple more verses to continue to make this point about how God moves other people in his providence. Go into chapter 30, verse 1. It came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag, that's his Philistine hometown, when they were come to Ziklag on the third day, it took them 3 days to get there, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and they smote Ziklag and burned it with fire. So David gets back to his Philistine city only to find the whole place on fire, and it's been looted and ransacked. Verse 2. And the Amalekites, they had taken the women captive that were there, and they did not kill anybody, great or small. They didn't. But they carried them away, and then they went on their way. So David and all of these Philistines were leaving the Philistine cities, and they were going up north to attack Israel, right? And David was sent back He didn't get to go up north and fight against Israel. He was sent back. And when he got back to Ziklag, he found out the Amalekites had come from the south and raided while there was nobody left at home as far as fighting men. And Ziklag wiped out the city and took all the people prisoner. And so David gets to Ziklag and he sees this situation. You see, he didn't realize that God sent David away from the battle with Israel because he knew, God knew that Ziklag was going to be attacked by these Amalekites, and David could do something about it. Now that's a fight God wants David to have, to wipe out these Amalekites that were also enemies of the Lord. That's a battle God does want David involved with. Think of it this way. I mean, it's sort of like if you're a store manager, okay, and you go back at night to your store to get something that you forgot, and when you get there, you find the store was robbed, right, by some petty kids, and you're going to go after them kids, right? That's the idea here. Ziklag has been looted and destroyed. Now, verse 3. So David and his men, they came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. You know, they're looking at a burned out city, guys. What do they know? What do they know about their wives? What do they know about their kids? Nothing. They don't know. They're assuming they're dead or taken. They don't know. But they don't see any dead bodies in the city. They're just assuming they will never see their families again. David had 2 wives at this point. Do you remember that? Abinoam and Abigail. So they're weeping. In fact, it says right there in verse 5, David had 2 wives that were taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. And David, in verse 6, was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, killing him, right? Because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. And I want to stop right there. So they get back, and everybody's mad at David. They're fed up. They're fed up. They're blaming it on the Hebrews, blaming it on the Israelite that's with us. And so they are in complete distress. This seems so low for David right now, doesn't it? What is God doing to me? Right? You ever been like that? Why is this happening to me, God? This seems like a low moment, and it really is. This really is a low moment. But you need to know, this is going to resolve really well. And David is going to learn some valuable lessons out of this. This is really happening to get David away from the battle with Israel. Now look, if David got back to Ziklag, and everything is peachy keen, hunky-dory, and David gets back to Ziklag, puts his feet up in the lazy boy, turns on the television, what's he thinking the whole time? If nothing happened at Ziklag, and he just goes home and what's for dinner tonight, dear? What's he thinking? He's still thinking about Israel. He's still thinking about the Philistines fighting Israel. You ain't keeping him away. He's going back. But God brings this situation along so David has something meaningful to do in the meantime to distract himself with godliness while God is working out the plan. And I really believe that's the way God works. God often brings things into our life that's meaningful while he's working out his plan. And so be busy for the Lord in the meantime. Take advantage of what's there, even in those low moments. Here, everybody is just completely distressed. They don't know what to do. And at the end of verse 6, this really leads us to our second point here at the end of verse 6. We've just talked about how in God's providence, he moves other people, right? But now as we get to the end of verse 6, I want you to see the second aspect of God's providence, which is this. God doesn't just move other people. God also, in his providence, knows how to move us on the inside. Our character, our heart, our emotions, the person within. I don't mean the way we react to things. I don't mean the way we put things into motion on the outside. I mean he knows how to change us on the inside. And look how that starts to happen here to David. It's at the end of verse 6. Everybody's mad. Everybody's mourning. There are no tears left. And then at the end of verse 6, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. In and through it all with David, No matter where he's at in life, he constantly comes back to God. Do you see? It's inescapable. Have you seen it already? It's inescapable. That even now, when tragedy strikes, David's like, I know where to go. I know where. We just saw Saul, the last chapter, in distress. And what did he do? He turned to the witch at Endor because God wasn't answering him. So he was willing to go anywhere. Here's David. And David, in times of distress, he's like, I need one thing. I need the Lord. And I need the encouragement of the Lord. Through the grief, through the anger of other people, David finds comfort in the Lord. And so can we. So can we still today. When God wants us to, our attention to adjust our course in life, are we willing to just humble ourselves and listen to the Lord? And that's what David's doing right now. He's taking that time to say, I need to draw near to the Lord. I need to see what the Lord's trying to do with me. And it's humbling to him. And he finds that encouragement in the Lord. That's exactly what he needs. See, there's moments in life where God's ready to put you into motion. God's ready to put David into motion. God's ready to put us into motion. And it takes coming to the Lord and being right there next to the Lord to listen and find out what his next steps are in the Lord. It kind of reminds me of Isaiah, right? When Isaiah was being commissioned to be a prophet for the Lord. And when God showed up to him in the early chapters of Isaiah, chapter 6, when Isaiah was commissioned, what did Isaiah say? He said, woe is me. I am a man of unclean lips. And when you understand that God is doing something in your life that's beyond you, he's moving things around, and you're like, holy Toledo, what's happening here? It's a humbling thing. It's a humbling thing. It makes you sit there like, I'm not even doing any of this. What is the Lord doing? What's happening right now? You just feel like it's completely out of your control. And that's exactly the way Isaiah felt. It's the same way Peter felt. Do you remember when the Lord came to Peter and he wanted to make him a disciple? And Jesus is like, so Peter, you're all about fishing, huh? You want some fish? Yeah. Cast your net on the right side of the boat. We already tried that, Lord. I'm the fisherman. You're the Messiah. You're the rabbi, okay? I'm the fisherman. Just go ahead and just amuse me, Peter. And he catches the great catch of fish, right? But what was Peter's reaction to that? He was humbled. Because he saw that the Lord is doing things in my life that I know nothing about. It has nothing to do with me. And yet the Lord is doing things. Have you had times like that? I hope you have. Where you're just like, there are things happening around me right now that only God is putting together. And that's what Isaiah experienced. That's what Peter experienced. And that's what David is beginning to experience right now in the next few verses especially. Go to verse 7 here. Verse 7, David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me here the ephod. Remember the girdle that they wore, the ephod, right? That the high priest wore. And so Abiathar brought there the ephod to David. And David inquired at the Lord, saying to the Lord, shall I pursue after this troop, these Amalekites? Shall I overtake them? And the Lord answered him and said, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail you will recover everything. So David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and they came to the brook Bezor, where those that were left behind stayed. There's going to be 200 of David's 600 men that stay there. They can't go the whole way. And in verse 10, David pursued, he and about 400 men, for the 200 abode and stayed behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Bezor. Now remember, what just happened here? If you don't remember, David and his 600 men, they just came back from the north. Remember, they were marching with the Philistines up north to the battle with Israel. And that's when David and his 600 men were turned away. Go home. Well, they get home and they realize Ziglag's burned to the ground. And they know the Amalekites did it. And so they're headed down south. Well, as the 600 are going, the 200 can't do it anymore. And so they stay. They're going to stay and be that defense while the other 400 go on. It's been estimated that they would have done, remember that it said it took them 3 days journey to get back to Ziklag? It's been estimated that they would have had to have done 50,000 steps per day for 3 days to get back to Ziklag. So think, some of you track your steps, right? What are you doing a day? 15,000? Maybe? If you get to 20,000, that's pretty hot, right? They did 50,000 steps a day for 3 days to get back home. So when it says these 200 men were faint, they're talking about they could not go on. These are men of war. They couldn't go on. And 400 do. 200 stay as sort of a defense there, and 400 of David's men and David go on further. So David asked, he didn't just pray, get comfort from the Lord. Now David asks of the Lord in the only way he knows how, with the high priest and with the priest's garment. And he says, Lord, what should I do? And the Lord answers him. The Lord answers him. And he gets comfort out of not just the fact that the Lord answered and said, yes, you should pursue him, but he gets comfort out of the fact that the Lord said there in verse 8, you're going to recover everything. The Lord answered him that specifically to give him that kind of comfort, to know that he would win. That is an encouragement. What an encouragement. Verse 11. So now they're going to pursue after these Amalekites, and they're going to get a helping hand from somebody that God happened to put in their path. Verse 11. And they found an Egyptian in the field, and they brought him to David, and they gave him bread, and he ate, and they made him drink water. And they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again into him. In other words, he was very weak and faint from not eating. His spirit came again to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said in verse 13, he said to this man, to whom do you belong? And where are you from? And he said, I'm a young man of Egypt, but I'm a servant to the Amalekites. Remember, that's who raided David's city. I'm an Egyptian, but I'm a servant to the Amalekites. And my master left me because 3 days ago I was sick. I fell sick. We made an invasion upon the south of the Cherethites and upon the coasts which belong to Judah, that's Israel, and upon the south of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. So now he's admitting that it was his group of Amalekites that did this. And David said to him, can you bring me down to these Amalekites, to this company? And he said, okay, I will, but swear unto me by God that you will neither kill me nor give me back to my master, and I will bring you to this company of Amalekites. So David nurses this Egyptian Amalekite servant back to health. And he's a castaway, this guy. Everything about him screams, I'm just a castaway, right? Did you catch that? He's an Egyptian. He's not even an Amalekite. He's there as a slave to the Amalekites. He falls sick and we don't need him anymore. He's sick. Let him go. Everything about this guy just screams, I'm a castaway. I'm a nobody. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares about me. My home people don't want me. I'm in a foreign land. Do you see where I'm going with this? David can relate to that. For 15 years, this is exactly how David has felt. I'm a nobody. I'm a castaway. My own people don't want me. The very people that I've spent all this time with, the very people my heart is connected to, don't want me. Can you relate to that? And David sees this Amalekite, this Egyptian who has been with the Amalekites, and he's like, I know you. I know what you're going through. I know what that's like. That's God giving David that comfort to say, I see you. You remember what God said to Hagar? Whenever Abraham and Sarah cast out Hagar, and then Hagar got the well of water, and she named it the God that sees me. See, when God puts people like this in David's life, it's God saying, David, I know the way you feel. I know you feel like a castaway right now, but I see you. I see what you're going through. David would have been humbled even by just seeing himself in this Egyptian castaway, because that's exactly the way David felt about his time with Saul. So God has been moving David on the inside, humbling David, changing David, adjusting his character, bringing David to that place where he's relying on the Lord, asking the Lord, staying tight with the Lord. God, what do I do now? It's so out of my control. What am I doing? And even through this circumstance with this guy, just tweaking David on that emotional, mental, character level, he's been changing him. Now we go to verse 16. And it goes now on to another part. So we've seen God in his providence moving other people. We've seen God in his providence moving David on the inside of David. And now we go to verse 16 through the end of this chapter. And I want you to see in God's providence how he starts moving David on the outside. Now he's going to have David start doing things, activities, doing things that will affect him taking the throne. So it starts on the inside and now it's coming to the outside of David. Verse 16, and when he had brought him down, behold, they were spread abroad upon the earth. So this castaway showed David where these Amalekites are, and David and his men see the Amalekites just all over the place, spread abroad upon the earth. They were eating and drinking and dancing because all of them had taken great spoil out of the land of the Philistines, but also out of the land of Judah. That's important, okay? So these Amalekites, they didn't just raid Ziklag, the Philistine city where David was, but they also been raiding into Judah and all around. That's important. Keep that in mind. And in verse 17, David smote them from the... You may have the word twilight right here in verse 17. That would not be a good translation. David smote them from the morning light even until the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men, which rode upon camels, and they fled away. And in verse 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil or anything that had been taken from them. David recovered all, because that's what God told him was going to happen. And in verse 20, David took all the flocks and the herds which they drove before those other cattle and said, this is David's spoil. So here we find David recovered everything, and he got extra spoil above and beyond. That's exactly what God said back in verse 8 was going to happen. They were going to recover all. And sure enough, David does that. I want to say it again just because people miss this. Don't think when the scripture mentions that David had 2 wives or anybody else had multiple wives, don't ever for a second think that that's in God endorsing David. Or don't ever think that's God saying that this is okay. Just because that's not part of the story tonight, don't accidentally get the impression, whoa, it's in the holy book, it must be okay. No, that's not the way it works. Okay? The holy book tells real events of real people. And I don't know if you've ever met real people, but real people are sinful. They're a wreck sometimes. So I just as a side note, don't ever read something in the scripture like that and just think, well, it must be okay. No, it's just not part of tonight's story to deal with polygamy being a sin. But it gets dealt with in David's life in many other ways, in other people's lives as well. So just need to get that out there. So the providence of God here to guide David, the God that David talks about, how God taught my fingers to battle, taught my fingers to war. God gives him the victory here. And so this is God using David to start manipulating the situations in a very outward way to bring David to the throne now. Because you're going to see, remember it said that these Amalekites, they didn't just attack Ziklag, the Philistines. Who else did they attack? Judah, right? And so God is going to use this to help David be remembered in the eyes of these Israelites, these Judahites, of who he is. Because you're going to find that David takes a lot of the spoil from taking out these Amalekites and he sends it to Judah. He's like, well, these Amalekites got some of this stuff from Judah, so I'm going to send it back to Judah. David making friends again of his own people. We'll see that here in just a second. So God is moving David to do things that he doesn't even realize now are setting the stage for him to take the throne of Israel. Not from Saul, but of Israel. Verse 21 now. So David came to the 200 men. Now, who are the 200? Remember, David has a band of 600 men. 200 stayed behind to be like a defense, and 400 went and wiped out these Amalekites. So verse 21, David came to these 200 men, which were so faint that they could not follow after David, whom they had made to abide at the brook Bezor. And they went forth to meet David and to meet the people that were with him. And when David came near to the people, David saluted the 200. So David doesn't have a problem with the 200 that stayed back. But watch what happens. In verse 22, then answered all the wicked men and the men of worthlessness, of Belial, that's what it means, of whom that went with David. So a bunch of the 400 that went with David and fought, they're mad. They're mad at the 200 that stayed back. Because they went not with us. We will not give them anything of the spoil that we have recovered, save to every man his wife and his children. And they may lead them away and depart. So they're like, the 200 that stayed back, they're not getting anything. We're giving their wives and kids back, but we're not giving any of the stuff back. And David, in verse 23, then said David, you shall not do so, my brethren, with that which the Lord has given us, who have preserved us, and have delivered the company that came against us into our hand. Number one, David says, wait a second. It's not up to you to determine what to do with it. The Lord's the one who got the victory today, not you. In verse 24, for who will hearken unto you in this matter? David's looking around saying, is anybody else going to listen to your foolishness? But as his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarried by the stuff. They shall part alike. The people that went to battle and the people that stayed back defending their stuff. Because think about this, guys. As the 600 men of Israel, 200 of them have to stay back. They didn't just stay by the river and have a party. The 200 that stayed back stayed with all of the worldly possessions that they had left, guarding that stuff, while the 400 went to battle with just what they needed for war. So it's not like the 200 had nothing to do. They were protecting everything else that they owned at that point. Okay? And David says it will be that the offense and the defense both get the same. Verse 25, it was so from that day forward that David made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel forever unto this day. So the principle that David learned and meted out right here is that the offense and the defense should receive equal reward. That's the principle that David implemented. The offense and the defense will receive equal reward. They both had a valuable role to play in the battle. Now, how many churches you ever met the older person in the church that's like, well, I'm 80 years old. I can't go to war anymore. I can't help around the church. Woe is me. I can't do anything. I'm useless. Right? We knew one or two like that recently, right? And you think to yourself, no, wait a second. No, you're the defense. You stay here at home. You guard the stuff. You're in prayer for us. You're supporting defensively what we're out there doing in attack. And they are just as important as the one going out into the warfare. The one that's there guarding the stuff. The one that's keeping the home fires burning, right? The person that's doing what they need to do back home. They're just as important. And that's the principle that God put on David's heart. Now, why did God have David do this? Why did God have David implement this principle of war? That the offense and the defense would both receive. Do you think you know why? See, God is moving David even by his own past experiences. Didn't this same exact thing happen to David? Do you remember the story? We read it a few weeks ago. Do you remember? Remember David was in the wilderness of Israel. It was right about the time he got his wife, Abigail. Remember? David was watching the sheep for Nabal. While Nabal's servants went off and did all the work, David and his men stayed back with the sheep. They were the defense. They guarded the sheep. And that's when David went to Nabal and said, hey, it's harvest time now. And, we've been back here watching your sheep while you guys have been out, doing more. Is it time for payday, right? And Nabal, that worthless fool, literally, he's like, who are you? Get out. And they wouldn't pay him. Remember that? And so David has been there. David has been somebody that's been that person back home, just keeping the home fires burning while things are happening. And he knows that those people are doing valuable work, just like the others that are out there doing the attacking, the offensive work. And think about it this way. David just saw Ziklag, his hometown, burned to the ground because there was no defense there while everybody marched off to war against Israel. God has been manipulating David's circumstances for David to learn that principle that your defense back home is just as important as your offense going out. Guys, you can relate that in so many things in life. Think about it this way. Your defense at your home needs to be protected and valued just as much as your offense of leaving your home and having ministry out there, going to try to win more. Both are so valuable to the Lord. So don't miss out on either. God has taught him this principle. Ziklag needed defended, and we left nobody there. We watched Nabal's sheep while they went off to do more, and we deserved reward. And David says, these 200 that stayed back and watched our stuff while we got the Amalekites, they deserve it. They deserve it. The defenders are just as valuable as the attackers. And so God has been working this out in David's life. Verse 26, let's finish this chapter. Verse 26. And when David came to Ziklag, he sent of the spoil. Now look at this. He took some of the rewards from the battle, and he sent them unto the elders of Judah. That's the southern part of Israel, right? Even to his friends, saying, behold, a present for you of the spoil of the enemies of the Lord, Jehovah, that is. And then he goes on to name 13 or more different places here, to whom which were in Bethel, and to them that were in the south of Ramoth, and to them that were in Jatir, and to them which were in Aroer, and to them which were in Sifmoth, and to them that were in Eshtimoa, and to them that were in Rachel, and in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, and to them which were in the cities of the Kenites, and to them which were in Hormah, and to them that were in Kor Ashan, and to them that were in Atalol, and to them which were in Hebron. Hebron obviously is a major city in Judah, in the south. And also to all the places where David himself and his men were wont to go. Remember, David for a long time in these 15 years had been going all around Judah in the south, just wandering around. Okay, so now David sends spoils from this war this is more than 13 different cities throughout Judah that David sends all of this to. See, God has moved David to give to everyone what is due. Okay? God moved David to give to the castaway what was due. God moved to give to the defenders what was due. God moved now for David to give back to Judah what was due. And it is a principle that God's been working in his life. And God's been moving David to outwardly do these things. And this will lead directly to how David takes the throne. I'm going to give something away now. Because when David begins to take the throne of Israel, where does it start? It starts in Judah. David first becomes king of Judah before he ever takes the throne for the entire nation. And I believe the Lord uses this exact time right now as David rightfully returns back to them what the Amalekites took. And God's going to use David's justice to have him have favor with the men of Israel in the south, which is in Judah. So God is orchestrating all these things, and David doesn't see any of it yet. He doesn't see any of it yet. And now chapter 31, to finish this book, chapter 31 is the demise of King Saul. Remember, we've been looking last chapter ago that how the Philistines were gathering at Aphek. And Israel was gathering under King Saul to go to this great battle. King Saul had already been told by Samuel showing up at God's providence that King Saul, you're going to die in this battle. And so, and by the way, I want to point something out real quick. When we looked at that chapter back there in chapter 28, remember Saul wasn't hearing from the Lord. And Saul said, oh man, if the Lord's not going to answer me about what to do with these Philistines, I gotta find out somehow. And so he turned to a witch in violation of everything in God's law, in violation of God's law that even he himself had previously enforced. He turns to the witch at Endor. Now remember, she's trying to conjure up some demon that she's used to talking to get a message across to this man, King Saul, that came to her. And the witch herself is even shocked when God sends Samuel, who had already died, to her. And something I wanted to point out to you, I think was interesting, is that one of the ways we know that her shock was because it wasn't the demon she was used to seeing, it was actually somebody God sent, Samuel, that showed up, is because demons don't know the future. And if you remember, what did Samuel, who showed up in a persona there to Saul, what did Samuel tell Saul? You are going to die, your sons are going to die, and this is when it's going to happen. The demons don't know the future, but everything that Samuel said happened. Just even more indication that it was God himself sent Samuel to address King Saul and tell him this is exactly what's going to happen. And now here in chapter 31, it happens. It happens. So the fourth thing I want you to see about God's providence, we've looked at the way God moves other people. We looked at the way God moves us on the inside, and God moves us on the outside to accomplish things that we don't even understand. And the last thing in this final chapter, just this brief little chapter that I want you to see about God's providence, is that it's in his timing. It's in his timing. It might take you 13 years in jail like Joseph. It might take you 5 years in a lonely place apart from the people you want to be with. It might take you 15 years wandering the wilderness of Judea, finally to end up with the Philistines. But it's in God's timing. He knows when to change and move things around. Chapter 31, let's finish this here, verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and they fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed hard after Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. You know, a side note, I think it's such a shame is the fate of Jonathan here. This man that was such a friend to David, this man that was such a godly example of faith and courage. One of the people, when I think of faith and courage, you know, the first person I think of is Caleb, honestly. But what about Jonathan? The loyalty he had, the faith, the courage. He's going to be an exciting guy to talk to in heaven sometime. You know, you think of all of the Bible characters. I want to see, Solomon, or I want to see Peter. What about Jonathan? This guy was amazing. Faith, courage, loyalty, which is a lot like faith, right? But here they are, the end of them. But Saul himself is wounded unto death. He gets shot with an arrow. Saul gets shot with an arrow. Now, I do want to point out, it mentions 3 of Saul's sons here that died in this battle. It's important for you to know that Saul does have other kids by a concubine. And we're going to talk about one of them, Ishbosheth, pretty soon as we open up 2 Samuel. Because Ishbosheth becomes a bit of a rival to the throne of Israel. So I just want you to recognize that not all of Saul's children die here. Not all of his sons die here. It's been about 15 years of David waiting. And finally, here's Saul, now on his deathbed as he's in the field. You remember when David came to avenge himself of Nabal? Remember we talked about Nabal wouldn't pay David and his men what was due. And David was coming to avenge himself. I'm going to take out Nabal. And what happened? God used Nabal's wife Abigail to teach David the lesson that vengeance and making wrongs right, that's God's business. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, right? And God used Abigail to teach David that one. And here we are in the end. Finally, God takes vengeance on Saul. Why now? Why after 15 years? Because God is not slack, as some men count slackness, but he's patient. And he's long-suffering for a reason. What does Peter tell us? He's patient, he's long-suffering. Why? Not willing that any should perish. When you think about this 15 years, do you think about David having to wait, David having to run, David having, oh, it's so hard? Or do you think it's God's grace to Saul and to all of the others that God is looking for their change? Look, I just need you to change. I just need you. I'm going to give you another day. I'm going to give you another day. And certainly Saul, in the end, he never does change. But how many others did? How many others did? Remember earlier, we even saw men of Saul. Saul told his servants to wipe out these priests, and some wouldn't do it. And they saw the light. And they followed the Lord and didn't kill the priests. And so you wonder how many did come to Christ in this time that David has been waiting. Because it's about more than just David. And even now, it's about more than just us. God is working a plan in his timing. And we need to trust that. We need to trust that. Even when it's 15 years, we need to trust that. There's things happening here for the glory of God and for the best of us that we need to see. Verse 4. So Saul is mortally wounded here on the battlefield. Verse 4. Then said Saul to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised Philistines come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer would not do it, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his own sword, and he died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor bearer, and all of his men, that same day all together. So Saul is mortally wounded by the arrow, and so Saul then falls on his sword, probably aiming for his heart, to die a quicker death. So some people think Saul committed suicide, right? He didn't. Saul was going to die. So he simply hastened the process so that the Philistines wouldn't come and abuse him while he was still alive. Now, they're going to abuse him after he's dead, but he knew he was going to die. There's no question, and he hastened the process. That's what this was. But the armor bearer, clearly here after he sees Saul is dead, the armor bearer certainly commits harry-carry, commits suicide, kills himself. We see that here. Now, I want to point something out because people get confused. It mentions here Saul's mortally wounded by an arrow. He asked the armor bearer to finish him off, and he wouldn't do it. So Saul does it himself. And it goes on to say here that Saul died. Okay? There's more in there to the story that's not recorded here. Okay? When we get into 2 Samuel chapter 1, it's going to give us a little more details that there's somebody else that came and saw Saul while he was in the process of dying, after he got hit by the arrow. And we'll get more of that story later. But I just don't want you to be confused as we get into 2 Samuel, and we're going to hear an additional part of what happened after Saul was hit by the arrow and before he finally died. There's more to the story. So we'll save that as we open up 2 Samuel. But they go together. The 2 parts go together. I just don't want you to be confused. So verse 7. Saul is now dead. And in verse 7... When the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley and they that were on the other side of the Jordan saw that the men of Israel fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and they all fled away. And the Philistines came and they dwelt in them. So basically now Israel is being pushed towards the west. Remember how there's some of the Israelite cities on Israel is being pushed towards the east. You know how there's some Israeli cities on the other side of the Jordan, right? On the east of the Jordan. That's where all of Israel and their army is now fleeing, towards the other side of the Jordan River. That's what this is talking about. And in verse 8, it came to pass on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain or the dead bodies, they found Saul and his 3 sons had fallen there on Mount Gilboa. And they cut off his head, and they stripped off his armor, and they sent the armor into the land of the Philistines all around, and published it in the house of their idols and among their people. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, that's a pagan goddess, right? And they fastened his body to the wall of Beth-shean. Beth-shean is an Israeli city in the north. Remember, I just said that all Israel was being pushed towards the east, even over the Jordan. And so the Philistines have pushed way in and taken over Israeli cities in the north, like Beth-shean, that they never should have been in. And they pin up Saul's body even on the wall in this place. So Saul's armor is now being sent around as a trophy. I mean, what abuse would Saul have suffered had they actually caught him alive? Think about it. This is just a wicked, wicked culture like that. Now, verse 11, and when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what was happening, I want to remind you who they are. Jabesh Gilead, that's a city of Israel that's way on the other side of the Jordan River. Okay, Jabesh Gilead is far away from the battlefield. But the word comes to them as all Israel is fleeing across the Jordan to the east. The men of this Israeli city, Jabesh Gilead, they hear that the battle is lost. And so again in verse 11, when they of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, then all the valiant men of Jabesh Gilead arose, and they went all night, and they took the body of Saul and the body of his sons off of the wall in the Israeli city of Beth-shean, and they came to Jabesh, and they burnt them there. So they took Saul and his sons' bodies, and they incinerated them. And in verse 13, and they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So they gave, basically, these men of Jabesh Gilead, they gave Saul and his sons a proper burial. They gave them a proper burial. They didn't want to just bury them naturally because they would be fearful that the Philistines would come and find his dead body and take it back again. So they burned him up and kept their bones. We will actually find that later on, David will even show even great respect again. And David will get the bones of Saul and Jonathan and these other sons and will take them back to Saul's hometown and into the tribe of Benjamin and give Saul and his sons even another proper burial back in his hometown, even after things are calmed down. So, do you end this book looking at the death of Saul and do you think to yourself, what a downer? Oh, Saul died, Israel's fleeing, what a downer. And that's okay. Maybe you should see it that way. But there's something else you should see, and I hope you didn't miss it. It was way back in chapter 16, when Saul had been the king for a year or so, and Saul rejected God. And Saul disobeyed God, never to turn back to God again. And that's when God anointed David. He said, I've rejected Saul. And David, I'm anointing you to be the king. Did you mourn then as you're mourning now for Saul? I hope he did. Because the death of Saul happened then. This is just the natural result of it. This is just the 15 years later, and God finally coming to the end of what he knew was every chance that Saul and all the people around Saul needed. And now it's over. Now that period of grace is over. I want us to see, back in chapter 16, when Saul was choosing to disobey God, I want you to see that as the death of Saul. This is just the natural outproduct of what Saul had been living for 15 years. And this is just, you look at this and you're almost like, yep, that was bound to happen. For 15 years we saw this coming. And guys, you can almost do the same thing with people around you today, right? You see people that are just living absolute reprobate lives. You talk to them about the Lord and they're like, no thanks. And then one day, years later, you hear of them dying and you're like, oh, it was a drug overdose? Yep. Not really surprised. Right? Still sad, don't get me wrong. but you're not surprised. You see Saul dead here on the battlefield, and you're like, could have seen that coming. He was disobedient to God for 15 years. So I just want you to think about it that way. This is finally God's timing to make this happen. The end of God's grace is finally here. So look, just as God has made promises to David that he would be king, David's going to take the throne one day. He's made promises for us too. He's made promises to us like, hey, look, you live your life in such a way, I will bless you. And then one day I am coming again for you. I'm going to take you to heaven. In my house there are many mansions. Where I am, there you will be with me one day. Does it go on 5 years and you're like, I don't really know if that's going to happen? Does it go 15 years and you're like, is this real? It is. And in God's providence, he's working things out to make it happen. And one day, all of a sudden, you're going to see everything moving around for the pieces to fall into place. Let God work it out. Just be obedient to what we know we need to do and let God work out the details. Number one, God knows how to move other people to make his plan for your life come to pass. God moved these Philistines to get David back to where David needed to be, away from Israel, away from seeing King Saul die on the battlefield, just like he moved Mary and Joseph back by using a Caesar of Rome to do it. God knows how to move people around you. Your problem is not the other person. You just need to focus it on God and say, God, I need you to work in their heart to accomplish your will. And then we need to be ready to respond to that. Number two, with God's providence, God knows how to move us on the inside. Just as God humbled David, just as God molded and changed David. When hard times come, let God mold us on the inside to seek him through those experiences. Let it change us on the inside. Don't ever come across a situation and just be the same afterwards. Let God do something in us because of it. Circumstances are God's way of chasing us towards him. That's what it's for. That's what it's for. Number three, God knows how to move us on the outside. David learned from past experiences on how to do new things today. Like, wait, the offense and the defense, they all need the reward. And so let God use the things you've been through to teach you new things. Oh, now, you know what? Now I'm going to start doing it this way because God's taught me something, right? And finally, number four, God's timing is already assigned. He already knows the day that he's coming back. Do you know that? God already knows the day he's sending Jesus back to get you. He already knows. It's not a surprise to him. He's got it planned out. We don't know it. Is it going to be like 13 years in jail for Joseph? Is it going to be like 15 years of being on the run like David? Or is it going to be tomorrow or tonight that the Lord comes and takes us? We don't know. But God knows. He's already got it figured out. That takes trust. And trust takes building a relationship and experiences with God and living with him and watching him. And as you experience God, you build that belief that he's going to do what he said he's going to do. So trust him. So this book ends with a reminder that God is in control. And we've come 16 chapters of David, like all this stuff of what's going on. And then all of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. Now he's going to take the throne. As soon as we open up chapter 2, or 2 Samuel, he's going to take the throne. All of a sudden, God just starts laying everything in line to make it happen. So be ready. At any moment, God can just have things happen in your life. Amen. That finishes 1 Samuel. Amen. Well, as is our custom, we're going to have communion now as we've finished the book. So feel free to take us